This week, we're going to talk a bit about media effects, what impact mass media actually has on us, and some of the theories that really revolve around this idea that the media is not only influential, but it has a direct reflection in how we live our lives. So the first theory I want to start with is the uses and gratifications theory, and there's 5 main assumptions we're going to talk about. Now, if you've already taken any of our social media coursework, you've probably already heard about this theory because it's an extremely relevant theory when we start to talk about mediated communication in specific, but truthfully, it really can reflect any type of mass media consumption we engage in. And so those 5 assumptions say that media use is goal directed and therefore media use has consequences. That means that the reason why we turn on a show, why we listen to a song, why we play a video game is a reflection of some sort of goal we're trying to achieve, something we want to happen. And because of that, there in turn are consequences to that use because we've already engaged in it very intentionally. And what we recognize is that the use of media can really satisfy a variety of needs or desires. And oftentimes the goal for why we're engaging in media use is to satisfy one of those needs or desires. So this means that social and psychological factors will mediate our behavior. How we think, how we feel, how we're reacting in our environment will influence how we engage with media. Now, we have to remember that media do compete with other forms of communication, and this is an important part of not just understanding uses and gratifications, but communication as a whole. Think about what you know about the communication process and how we talk about feedback and noise as influencing factors in communication. Well, oftentimes media itself is that noise. It can be that distraction from other forms of communication. Think about when you sit down to work and you have your computer in front of you and your phone next to you, and you're really trying to study, right? But your phone keeps going off. That can be a distraction. So we know that media compete with one another for our own intention. Now, people are usually more influential than media, and this is an important recognition when we talk about these media effects theories, because we've seen a variety of takes already on to what degree the media influences us. So remember that oftentimes the people in our lives are often more influential than the media itself, but certainly we're all influenced by the media on a greater scale. Now, this is what the uses and gratifications model looks like. First, we consider the individual characteristics of the person who is consuming the media, right? So what are their demographics? What sort of social characteristics do they have? And what sort of psychological or psychographic characteristics do they have? Because we know that that existing information about ourselves, the things we use to describe our identity, do influence the way we act. That then leads us into the motives. And there's really 2 different types of motives. We have traditional motives, which include entertainment, escape, looking for information, or trying not to feel as lonely, right? These are reasons why people have consumed media for ages and ages. But now with new media, the incorporation of online and particularly social media, we see additional motivations being introduced. Social connection, the feeling of status or coolness, exhibitionism, so that ability to express ourselves and to show off and to really reflect our identity on a bigger scale. Certainly we use it for relationship maintenance. We know communication is an important part of maintaining a relationship. And then we might also use it to meet new people, right? That might be why you're using something like Tinder or Bumble. So these motivations have really just expanded with the increasing communication technology. And now we can see that there's a lot of different reasons why people might engage with a certain piece of media. Once we understand that motivation or that goal, remember this is goal oriented, then we can really start to look at the use, which means how much time do they spend with that media? How intensely are they involved with that media? And then to varying degrees, how dependent are they on that media? So if you're someone who's like, every morning I wake up and I have to check my TikTok messages, or I have to check my email, that might reflect to you a little bit of dependency and intensity in your use of that specific media. And because of these three components, the individual characteristics, the motives, and the use, we often see some sort of effect happen. These are the consequences of use. And I will say these effects do increase as use increases, right? So the more time you spend, the more intense you are in being involved with that piece of media, or the more dependent you are on that piece of media, the higher the likelihood that there's going to be greater consequences of use. Whereas if we're using something much more casually, we're less likely to be as influenced by it. So I really like this uses and gratifications model as we talk about these other media theories, because to me, this is sort of the original media theory. Why do we do what we do? Why do we choose to play a video game? Why do we choose to make a phone call? Why do we choose to text somebody, right? What is the motivation behind that? Because I think a lot of times when we reflect on our motivations for media use, we can start to really reflect on the effects and consequences of that use as well, especially looking at the amount of use. Now, the next theory we're going to look at is social cognitive theory. And social cognitive theory really is more of a behavioral theory than it is a media theory, but it has a significant crossover, and you'll start to see why in the next few slides. But social cognitive theory, like I said, started out as a sociological theory or even a psychological theory. And the basic assumptions were this idea that we learn from observation, and that these cognitive processes actually influence our own motivation and learning. So by observing the world around us, the environment around us, people we respect, people we care about, we are in turn learning appropriate behavior and modeling that behavior based on what we see. And so they call this the modeling process. And the modeling process has basically three components. First, identification of the good or bad behavior. Then, whether or not there's existing inhibitory or disinhibitory effects. Inhibitory effects discourage a behavior, whereas disinhibitory effects encourage a behavior. Now, how social cognitive theory came to be, and your chapters talk about this a little bit, was there was a research study conducted where they used a Bobo the Clown doll, and you can see that in the picture here. And if you're not familiar with these types of clown dolls, they basically were inflatable dolls that were weighted at the bottom, that when you push them, they would come back, right? So they couldn't actually fall over. So they separated a group of children into two groups. The first group of children were in a room with Bobo the doll, and they watched some adults actually push, hit, sort of abuse this Bobo the Clown doll, get really physical with it. And then when the adults left the room and the children were left alone with Bobo the doll, they modeled that same behavior. They became aggressive with the doll, they were physical with the doll, they were hitting, punching, mimicking the behaviors of the adults. However, the second group of children, they were in a group with adults who just praised and talked to the doll, didn't physically touch the doll at all. And what happened was that second group of children mimicked that behavior. And so it really reflected this idea that, yes, observation is very influential to us. It is a signal to us on what is appropriate or not appropriate in society. And so for these children, they were mirroring what they thought was an appropriate behavior because this is what the adults were doing. Now, of course, we know this has varying effects, and obviously kids are a great example of people who observe and take in the world around them and then act on it as well. We know as adults, we maybe have a little bit more thought process before we act and behave, but it's a great simplistic way at really demonstrating how influential our own ability to observe the world is. And this is especially important when we talk about cultivation theory. Now, cultivation theory came at a time when we really saw mass media take off, right? Radio, TV, these are all brand new technologies. They're very exciting. And we find that, wow, the TV is a very effective storyteller. And because of that, it becomes an intrinsic part of our culture. So what cultivation theory really posited was that when they see these recurring patterns in messaging on television or on radio or in really any media we consume, this tends to make the behavior seem not only more acceptable, but more widespread than it might be. And so what cultivation theory really presented was this idea of message system analysis, that by looking at the recurring patterns on television, we could kind of pick up what cultural influence they might have. For example, excessive violence on TV, the recurrence of the news talking about negative and scary things. And this creates this feeling that there's this widespread negativity in the world. And cultivation analysis actually has a term for that. It's called mean world syndrome. It says that when you consume media, that tends to make it look like the world is more violent, more negative, more mean than it actually is, because we know that's what sells. It creates this mean world syndrome. So we have this view that our culture is a lot more violent, a lot more negative, maybe even a lot more split or against one another than it really is because of these depictions on TV. And this is a reflection of what we call a mainstreaming effect, which is that when a large group of people consume the same media, right, the same messaging again and again on a recurring pattern with similar message themes, it can actually build a very homogenous worldview, even though we come from different backgrounds. So what that's saying is, wow, this mass media is really influential in establishing a shared view amongst people who might come from different backgrounds, different cultures. Now, the scary thing here when we talk about a mainstreaming effect is this idea that these are not always narratives we have control over. Oftentimes it's traditional media, it's TV, it's Hollywood who has control over these narratives that are indirectly influencing us. Now, when we talk about these media effects, we do have to talk about a theory called third-person effects. And third-person effects is a funny theory because it's a theory about effect theories. And what it basically says is that as we're learning about these media effects theories, we're often talking about others, right? Others around us, thinking that the media definitely influences the others around us more than it influences ourselves. And what that is called is the perceptual hypothesis. This idea that we think, oh, I'm not as influenced by the media, but all of you are. This idea that we think we are separate from that influence, which is not true. We are all influenced by the media, maybe in different ways and with different motivations and different purposes. But this perceptual hypothesis really reflects this perception that we think we are above this influence, when in reality, we are all party to it. And then behavioral hypothesis looks at the idea that not only do these people believe that media affects others more than themselves, that perceptual component, it then leads them to take action to control or limit that media influence. So we saw this a lot in the early 90s when video games became really popular. And the idea was that a lot of people thought violent video games were going to directly create much more violent children, much more violent young adults. And because of this fear, right, this perception, mind you, these are not people who are actually engaging in video games. They are people observing the violence of video games and thinking they are above that influence. They started to be very concerned about how they were going to limit access to these video games. And that's why you actually see on CDs and video games today those specific ratings to let you know what level of violence or graphic material is inside of that. That was a result of this action to control or limit that media's influence, right? To say only certain ages have access, only certain types of children should have access, really establishing thresholds to try and diminish that media influence. And again, it's funny because a lot of those decisions were made by people with this perceptual hypothesis, this belief that the media influences others, like children, more than it influences themselves. Now, if you have adults in your life, and especially if you have parents in your life who you know are directly influenced by media, I know I have a dad who's addicted to YouTube. It's funny now to think that they ever judged the media influence we have, because I just had a phone call from my dad the other day saying Clint Eastwood was dead because he saw it on YouTube, which was not true. So those are the types of things we have to really consider when we're talking about these media effects, is that we ourselves, even if we know about them, we ourselves are not immune from them. Now, there are factors that influence the third person effect. They include social desirability. and social distance. Those are two things that might influence how we perceive these third person effects and really just the nature at which we act on that behavior modification. Our next theory is affordance theory, and affordance theory is similar to our cultivation theory in that it's looking at how other factors influence us, but this one is going to specifically look at the environment and the technologies we have available. So the main proposition of affordance theory says, hey, we make perceptions about an environment that leads us to some course of action. The setting we are in directly influences how we act. And I think that this is a really good proposition to reflect this idea that yes, we are influenced by our motivations. Yes, we are influenced by our identity. Yes, we are influenced by X, Y, and Z. But we can't disregard that the environment around us is also influential. And those affordances, where affordance theory comes from, really looks at this idea of what media technologies allow people to do. And it also helps us explain the relationship between an object and the user, because we know media technologies really allow us to interact with our environment or escape our environment in really significant ways. Not only does it help us stay connected with the world around us, it also helps us access information about the world around us. And so these affordances look at this idea of how we interact with these objects in reference to our environment. And there's three types of affordances we'll look at. First is the perceived affordances. This is how we perceive the actions we can take with an object, right? So if I have a phone in my hand, what all can I do with my phone? What are things I know I have the ability to use this object for? And how might they differ from my computer or from my Apple Watch, right? What are the actions that are specific to those objects? Then we have social affordances, and these are the properties of an environment or object that enable social actions. So again, when we talk about these communication technologies, particularly phones, computers, online media, we are talking about something that really allows us to engage in social actions. And then the last one is a communicative affordance. This is the possibility for action that arise from interaction between a user and technology. So many of the affordances we think about here, obviously in media theory, is how do we afford it, this interaction between technology and ourselves, and what are the possibilities that exist for this technology. Now keep in mind that these affordances reflect this idea that yes, you might think you can do certain things with an object, and sometimes that's not always what happens. That's why we say they're perceived. For example, you think you're going to post something to Brightspace and you go and the server's down, right? You weren't able to engage in that specific action, but you perceived that you could. Now, we can't talk about media effect theories without talking about online disinhibition effect. And again, you've probably talked about online disinhibition effect in your other classes. This is a very significant theory we talk about consistently in the field of communication, especially when we're talking about mediated communication, that online communication. And what online disinhibition effect calls attention to is that sometimes people behave differently online than they would in person. And there's two different types of disinhibition we see. There's toxic disinhibition, which means they act more negatively, more toxically online. And then there's benign disinhibition, where they might be outside of their comfort zone, but it's not malicious. It's not negative. They may be engaging in behaviors they wouldn't normally do in person, but not at the harm of others. And there are really three causes we look to that create this environment for online disinhibition, this feeling of disconnection where we feel we can be something different than we normally are. First, and number one, is anonymity. This feeling that people don't really know who we are online, or maybe we've actually gone incognito online. We have an avatar or an alias or something that makes us feel safer expressing some of the more ugly sides of our personality. There's also lag time often in communication. So you might post a comment and not get a response until days later. That oftentimes makes it feel safer to engage in behavior online we normally wouldn't, because we can kind of do it and run away. And then the lack of nonverbal cues. We're not getting that negative nonverbal communication, that body language, that response that we normally would. That might be a deterrent. So because we're not getting that, oftentimes we don't deter ourselves at all. And that's really where we see online disinhibition come into rise, is this feeling like no one's going to know it's me. I can post it and I can run away. And really, there's no, to me, social repercussions because there's no nonverbal behavior happening. There's maybe some arguing or trolling in the comments, but it's also very possible I did that to create it. And that's where we see things like trolling and rage bait really take flight, is this online disinhibition to the next level where we're engaging in these online arguments, really just for the joy of angering people. And this idea of perception online is something we will see a lot of theories revolve around. So we have this dramaturgical theory. In dramaturgical theory, we talk about a bit in a couple other classes as well. If you've taken Principles of Social Media, I know we talk about it in there. But it looks at these main assumptions that who we are and who we project out to the world is a performance. We engage in what we call impression management. So it's very dramatic, right? I am a different person in front of my students than I would be in front of my family, than I would be in front of my friends, because our self is a performance, and oftentimes we alter that performance based on who's around us. So this impression management often influences how we are treated by others because we are directly altering ourselves to suit their needs, their wants, or what we think is going to be socially acceptable by that individual group. But ultimately, what dramaturgical theory says is that these theatrical metaphors are really functional in describing how we present the self. And they divide the behaviors up into two categories: front stage behaviors, the ones we present to the public, to the outside world, and then backstage behaviors, things we keep private that we don't necessarily articulate on the internet or show in front of people, or that we would really advertise. So a front stage behavior, this is how you present yourself to others. If you want to seem professional, maybe you are funny, maybe you are outgoing, maybe you are shy. Those are the ways you present yourself to others. And then backstage behaviors are the things we keep private. We might only share with our significant other or partner. We might only share with people we are extremely close with. Or they might even be behaviors that we keep completely private that we don't tell anyone about, that you do behind the scenes. These are together really a reflection of ourself, but ultimately the version of ourself that people see in person and especially online is usually going to reflect only those front stage behaviors. This is why I always remind students, hey, when you're watching influencers online, when you're watching celebrities, when you're following people on social media and you think that their life looks so glamorous and so impressive, just remember that this is only a reflection of their front stage self. This is their perfectly curated version of their self. This is their dramaturgical version of their self. Because I think that is an important component. We don't always know what is happening backstage with others, even when they present themselves seemingly very openly in public. Now, the last theory we're going to cover is social capital theory. And social capital theory is a great theory that reflects that these effects also have an influence on the relationships we build. So social relationships are resources that can lead to the development and accumulation of what we call human capital, aka friends and family, right? This ability to attract people into your network. That is social capital theory. And it reflects this idea that the behaviors we engage in and how we present ourselves to others can really create positive social relationships. And as we garner this social capital, we're going to build out our network of people. And there's two types of social capital. First, there's bridging capital. And bridging capital is used when we're talking about someone we wouldn't normally be close friends with and we are growing close with. So this type of social capital takes people who are quite different and bridges them together, usually on some sort of shared interest, shared goal, shared hobby, right? We're talking about people who are coming together over something that they both really are passionate about. Now, they are very different people, and maybe they wouldn't necessarily normally be friends or close to one another, but they're able to bridge that gap, bridge those differences over this shared interest. We see this type of capital form a lot in work relationships because oftentimes we start out as coworkers and we have a very professional relationship, and then we find something to bridge those gaps over, and that's what makes us feel connected to someone like a coworker. Then we have bonding capital, and bonding capital is the one you're maybe more familiar with. This is capital that really is something that brings people closer together. So I already relate to you, we're maybe already close, but then there's a piece of media or there's a hobby or a shared interest that we are really united on, and we're going to further bond over that, which is going to allow us to grow even closer. And we should always be engaging in these different types of social capital because as we bridge, as we bond, we find that these relationships become more enriching for us. And that means that these hobbies or shared interests that have connected us only further build those relationships. Now, keep in mind, we're often going to be using communication technologies to engage in these social relationships and to help build this social capital. Now, this is just the start of the media effects that we will observe in this class. I think some of these theories here are really the foundational ones in terms of media effects, especially the uses and gratifications theory, cultivation theory, and I would say that dramaturgical theory is one we consistently see to be especially true. But think about these theories, which ones really resonated with you, and which are the ones that you think really describe some of the communication behaviors you yourself engage in?